Welcome to the debate. Today we're tackling what is, well, perhaps the most fundamental dividing line in the philosophy of history, the complex, and I'd say often fraught relationship between historical representation and the past itself. This isn't just some abstract theoretical question. It really dictates the methodology we use when we, open an archival box.
It really is. It's the line that separates what historians believe the discipline is ultimately capable of achieving. I mean, are we recovering the past? Or are we merely constructing texts about the past?
Exactly. And to frame this discussion clearly, we have to address this concept of an independent reality. When we say text, we mean the whole totality of representations. Archived documents, court records, chronicles, testimonies, really all the forms, written or spoken, that transmit the past to us.
So the critical question then becomes this. Does the past, the events, the experiences, the relationships, does it exist independently and, crucially, knowably of these forms? Or, conversely, is our historical knowledge entirely constituted within the texts themselves, making the past inaccessible as a separate external reference point?
And that's the divide. I'll be arguing that yes, an independent past reality exists and is, partially accessible through a very close and highly inferential reading of these sources. This aligns broadly with the microhistory perspective.
And I will be taking the position, which aligns with robust critical approaches often labeled postmodern, that an accessible, external, measurable reality is simply not available to function as a pure reference point for historical knowledge. Our understanding is, in my view, inherently mediated and fundamentally textual.
So my position is essentially this. Practitioners of microhistory, following figures like Carlo Ginzburg, we accept the foundational critique that texts are constructed, they're often biased, they serve as strategic narratives, of course. But, and this is the key, we assert they are not arbitrary fictions. Our core thesis is that these documents are imperfect, incomplete, and fundamentally indirect windows to events that truly happened.
So you concede the text is a strategic construction, but you insist on keeping a tether to something beyond it.
Exactly. The text isn't the reality itself, it's just a very imperfect recording medium. And this commitment allows us to use what Ginzburg called the clue paradigm. The historian in this model acts a bit like a detective. We use the text's internal contradictions, its silences, its gaps, and the things the document, unintentionally says to make powerful inferences about the world outside the text.
The involuntary disclosure.
Precisely. For us, the text doesn't establish reality, it carries traces of it. And this commitment, however difficult the process of recovery is, allows us to maintain history's claim to being a discipline focused on evidence-based knowledge. Historical knowledge is radically difficult, yes, and contingent, and partial. But it is possible.
I approach this from a different methodological angle, one that looks at that idea of an accessible, fixed reality outside the text with deep suspicion. Our core thesis is that what we call historical reality is knowable only through our established interpretive frameworks and narrative practices.
So you're denying the possibility of access to the outside.
I'm asserting that we cannot access a raw, pre-interpreted past. Our knowledge is always irredeemably mediated by language and by our own narratives, and this shift in focus is critical. The main concern here is epistemological, how we know, not strictly ontological, if the past existed. Of course, the past happened. The question is, what can we use as an external, unassailable criterion for measuring our knowledge of it?
And you would say no such criterion exists.
That's right. The core assertion is that reality can't function as a pure, direct, and measurable reference point outside of the text. The text doesn't merely reflect reality, it actively constructs it, shapes it, gives meaning to it. And because of this inherent mediation, that clean separation between a real event and a textual account, it just becomes impossible to maintain rigorously.
For us, reality is, you could say, an effect that's produced within and among texts.
And now we get to the heart of the disagreement, which is about the very nature of historical access. If the text is purely constructed, as you emphasize, then what do we make of its involuntary contradictions, its sudden rhetorical stops, or its self-defeating language?
These are the clues, the subtle signs that I would argue genuinely point beyond the textual boundary. The microhistorical approach finds genuine, inferential evidence in the text's very failures to fully contain the past. That's a compelling argument, I'll grant you, but I would frame the interpretation of those gaps very differently. I'm just not convinced that the historian can simply, jump over the textual boundary through a supposed clue.
Why not? Look, if we find a 17th century court deposition where a witness describes a local practice, say a specific communal ritual, but the court clerk dismisses it as irrelevant nonsense, the microhistorian sees that dismissal as a high-value clue. It tells us something about the lived world that the official text couldn't absorb or control. That gap is the sound of reality pushing back.
I see why you think that, but let me offer a different perspective. The moment you identify that trace or clue, that gap, that dismissal, you are already doing immense interpretive work. You're contextualizing it, defining its significance against what the court should have done, and you're filling in the silence with a sophisticated, reconstructed narrative about local ritual. By that very act, you've embedded it within another interpretive framework, your own.
We'll acknowledge the interpretation, of course, but the raw fact of the discrepancy remains. The fact that the text required interpretation, that it couldn't be smoothed over, that confirms the pressure from an external, non-textual source.
No, I'd say it confirms the pressure of competing discourses. The witness's testimony is one narrative, and the clerk's dismissal is a competing narrative from the official state discourse. You're simply choosing which narrative, in this case, the marginal one, you find more persuasive. That so-called trace isn't an independent reference point. It's just another textual effect that reveals the limits of a dominant power structure's language, not necessarily the structure of reality itself.
But if we follow that path, we lose the capacity to establish any hierarchy of knowledge.
And that is precisely the challenge we have to face. Since texts construct and don't merely reflect, there is no final, undisputed text outside criterion to determine which narrative is more real. If we can't rely on a shared external reference, a kind of control group for the past, then establishing a stable hierarchy between competing narratives becomes extremely difficult. If the past can't operate as the external benchmark, all narratives risk being equally valid simply because they're all linguistically mediated.
I'm sorry, but I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it renders the entire historical endeavor meaningless beyond, say, aesthetic or literary critique. This isn't just theory. This decides what goes into a PhD thesis. If evidence and falsification are meaningless concepts, which your approach implicitly suggests by rejecting that external standard, then history abandons its core knowledge claim. If we can't demonstrate that event A happened and event B did not, based on traces, then what are we doing?
We're not abandoning meaning, we're redefining where meaning resides. We are questioning the ability of evidence to function as an unproblematic standard that can transcend language. Historians spend enormous effort crafting better, more nuanced narratives, but they are still narratives. Difficulty, as you said, does not equate to impossibility, but radical mediation does equate to the fundamental unavailability of that pure reference. We can't step outside the linguistic cage to see if the past matches our text.
But the sheer weight of archival material demands a methodological standard higher than aesthetic choice. The historian's task is fundamentally different from the novelist's, and this is why the separation between our schools is so critical. Microhistorians use the narrative as a tool for reconstruction, but we staunchly refuse to suspend the claim to evidence-based knowledge. We have to anchor our discipline in the belief that events lived independently of our narratives.
I come at it from a different way regarding the ultimate consequences. When you insist on a rigid, evidence-based knowledge claim tied to an accessible outside reality, you are, I think, glossing over the radical problem of mediation that affects every single primary source you use.
But that radical mediation which we accept doesn't negate the external anchor. It just makes reaching that anchor incredibly hard.
It makes it conceptually impossible to reach outside the textual framework. Postmodernism centers the narrative itself and recognizes that the history we write is inherently a form of literary discourse, even when it claims objectivity.
If you are right, history maintains its identity as a science. If I am right, history is fundamentally a humanities discipline defined by its textual production. That distinction is the ultimate conceptual clarity we're seeking here.
This conceptual divide often leads to a common, yet I think severe, misunderstanding of your position. I want to address the most radical statement of this school, the idea that there is no reality outside the text. If you genuinely believe we lack that external standard, are you also asserting that nothing actually happened in the past?
Absolutely not. And that is the critical point that often gets lost and caricatured in debates like this one. The assertion that we lack an external reference point does not mean that physical objects or historical events did not exist or happen. That would be an absurd ontological claim that frankly few serious critics actually hold.
So the focus is purely epistemological.
Precisely. It means that knowledge of the past cannot be based on an undisputed, final external standard that is untouched by language or interpretation. The past's existence is generally not denied. Its unmediated accessibility is the focus of the skepticism. We're asserting that reality isn't available as a pure, direct, and usable criterion against which to measure the veracity of a text.
And that clarification is vital because it highlights the exact point of divergence. While both our approaches accept that texts are profoundly constructed, the microhistorian makes that final leap, accepting the limitations while maintaining the possibility of recovery through clues that escape the text's control.
And we reject the possibility of that leap, viewing the clue itself as already part of the system of signification. If you use the clue, you are still using the text. You are not escaping it.
To summarize my perspective then, I fully acknowledge the immense value of the rigorous challenge provided by this critique of narrative construction. Your challenge ensures that we are never naive about our sources. However, for me, the core epistemological commitment remains, the belief in an independent, partially recoverable past reality. If we abandon this belief, I think the historian's unique function collapses. This is what separates us from simply being literary critics, and that allows us to maintain a claim to fact over mere narrative effect. We can still aspire to historical truth, even if we know that truth is always provisional.
And I'll reaffirm that understanding opposing viewpoints strengthens our own thinking. The essential disagreement, as we've discussed, lies in that search for an external, final reference point. Our position argues that the past reality is simply not available as a pure external criterion. And this debate, I think, shows that this conceptual clarity is vital to determine if history is defined by its pursuit of the past, a pursuit I argue is structurally constrained by the archive, or if it is defined by its necessary production of texts about the past.
It is striking, though, that both approaches shared a necessary skepticism toward grand narratives and official documents. There's a clear methodological kinship in that initial suspicion.
True, but the divergence on the possibility of truth is where the historical discipline really pivots. So the listener is left to consider whether the pursuit of historical truth is inherently constrained by the text, locking us forever within its structure, or whether the text, through its imperfections, does offer sufficient paths to access the worlds that existed before it was written down.
Thank you for joining us for the debate.